Hello, my name is Todd Wilson. I'm a facilitator in the Multipliers Pathway process. I'm glad you're joining me today. This is one of our supplementary videos. The Gospel Saturation Vision Scope is the master tool that we're using throughout the journey. We're about a third of the way through this process with the cohort we're in, and I want to really just press into an overview of the Gospel Saturation Vision Scope with some of the adjustments that we've made to it. So today I'm going to simply walk through. This will be review for some people, but I'm going to do my best to integrate a number of the things we've talked about into one, hopefully fairly cohesive, short video summary of the Gospel Saturation Vision Scope. So thanks for joining me. First thing is this Gospel Saturation Vision Scope looks like a scope on a gun when you look through it with the crosshairs in the middle. There are 6 elements to this Gospel Saturation Vision Scope. All the way around the outside, the circle that shapes things are what we would call multiplication values. We're doing this journey to help churches either engage multiplication or become more aggressive in multiplication. So we're looking through the lens of multiplication values. It shapes how we do everything we do. And that's why that outer ring goes all the way around the outside of the circle, these multiplication values that shape how we do everything we do. The second element is the gospel saturation vision that we put in the center of the circle. That is this idea of what does it look like for every man, woman, and child in the geography to have multiple touches, positive touches with the gospel of Jesus. This is really a game changer in this process. Most churches have some form of a functional vision that has to do with growth and getting larger. What the gospel saturation vision is intended to drive us to do is think more, honestly, more abundantly of something even bigger than growing a large individual church. To truly get the gospel saturation and a gospel saturation vision, we not only have to grow bigger, we've got to plant churches, we've got to mobilize just about every Christ follower as a disciple who's an everyday missionary who's penetrating into the cracks and crevices of society. So we do spend time on this vision to really help people see the difference between a vision rooted in growth and size versus one on what I would call extension and penetration into the cracks and crevices of society. Where we've really dwelt in recent gatherings is on this idea of identity. The upper left corner, the third piece of the 6 elements of the gospel saturation vision scope, are what we call micro pathways. About there being 3 different, I'm going to call them pathways. You could say roles or identities of any disciple. A disciple is to be a disciple maker, they're to be an everyday missionary, and some are to move from servant or servant leader to leaders planting churches. We've talked about the idea of the micro and the macro. We intentionally call those pathways in the quadrant in the upper left, micro pathways. And the distinction of micro is that's the experience that an everyday disciple has as they grow and mature. It's not the programming of the church. It's not all the things that church leaders do. It's the actual experience that an individual disciple has as they're doing their day-to-day things. The micro pathway then is the collective experiences that help grow everyday disciples into generational disciple makers, mobilized everyday missionaries, and catalyzers of new faith communities. I'm careful there to call it catalyzers of new faith communities because not everybody is going to plant churches, but most Christ followers have the ability to help catalyze in some form or fashion new gatherings around faith. And those could be gatherings doing Bible studies together, discipleship groups, new faith-based ministry. There's a whole lot of different ways to gather Christ followers and gather people around their faith. And so that's what I mean by catalyzing new communities of faith. Macro then is the culture that's created by church leaders to help shape the micro experiences of everyday disciples. So where the micro is from the perspective of the individual disciple, the macro is the culture that church leaders put in place and the culture that exists within the church to shape those micro experiences. We talked about the culture alignment model. This is sort of our primary macro tool. Culture is the alignment of our values, language, and narratives, along with our behaviors and expectations. Again, what we value, those aren't what we do. Those shape how we do everything we do, which needs to align then with the language that we use and the things we celebrate, even definitions in the language. And then behaviors are as much about expectations as we have for people as what the things we're putting in place do to shape behaviors. And we've talked in this process so far that this idea of language, I think people are coming to appreciate that just how we define things like disciple and disciple maker, this idea of an everyday missionary, that's a problematic term for some and not for others. And so just the language that we rally around is a vitally important thing. These three micro pathways, then, I call them the multipliers pathway. Every individual disciple should be a missionary disciple maker, integrating these roles together of disciple maker, missionary, and leader. We covered the three dimensions of multiplication, and it's not by coincidence that those three roles of an everyday missionary line up with the three different dimensions of multiplication: the disciple-making scale, the mobilization scale, the capacity building or leadership scale. I'm going to walk through each of those and link them to the micro pathway and the mobilization flywheel. So here's where we see, if we just summarize, there's the three dimensions in the first column: disciple-making, mobilization, capacity building, that we just saw in the diagram. There's three different roles that an everyday disciple plays: a disciple maker, a missionary, and a leader. And in that micro pathway, we're trying to help people move from disciple to disciple maker, and from member to everyday missionary, and from servant to church planter. The culture that's got to wrap around that, and this is where we get a little bit of cross currents going, is that we've simultaneously in sort of the programmatic operating system of the U.S. church, when it comes to disciple making, we're really needing to shift our macro culture from a programmatic growth engine and operating system to a disciple making culture. And then the consequence of that programmatic growth engine that we have is that volunteerism ends up overtaking this idea of creating a mobilization culture where we help mobilize everyday missionaries into the cracks and crevices of society. So we've also got to work on our macro culture, moving from volunteer to mobilization culture. And then finally, we've got to, on the capacity building side, we've really got to move from growing, a growing orientation in our culture to a reproducing culture. We do have a couple of additional supplementary videos that are coming out on these three elements of culture. There's one video on moving into a culture of disciple making, a second on creating a culture of mobilization, and we'll have a third on this culture of capacity building. So on the first dimension, disciple maker, we've got the disciple, and the path is moving to disciple maker. We call that the disciple maker's pathway in this multipliers pathway. If we really press into that dimension, Jesus' plan is for relational disciple making as our mission and growth engine. On the sort of addition end, we're making disciples. On the multiplication end, who make disciples. So back and forth, disciples who make disciples who make disciples. When that happens generationally, when a disciple makes disciples who makes disciples who make disciples, we're seeing both generational disciple making, but even better, we're seeing multiplication at its smallest core. The building blocks of multiplication are the disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple. The pathway that we've presented in its most simple form, and this is what each church needs to decide what theirs is going to be. This is the basic, sort of minimalist pathway for a disciple maker's pathway. Step one, becoming a disciple. All the things that we do to reach pre-disciples and help them become disciples. Those disciples need to be growing as disciples. They need to be making other disciples. The subtle but significant shift in thinking is not just making disciples, but making disciple makers. That's where that generational piece comes in. It's also what is potentially a distinctive between evangelism and discipleship. I'm sharing my faith 100 times a week with somebody, but doesn't necessarily I'm making disciples who turn around and make disciples who make disciples. So we're looking here at helping move from making disciples to making disciple makers. And then eventually, when that happens enough times, this individual disciple maker is then experiencing generational multiplication. If we move on to the second micro pathway, then the missionary pathway, we've got on one end the family member. We're members of this family called the local church, and we're helping people in the missionary pathway move from not just being family member, but being an everyday missionary. If we press into that one, Jesus' plan is that we have everyday missionaries where they work, live, and play. This is the mobilization spectrum. And this is it is an and. All of these spectrums are an and. So when we say pathway, we're not saying move away from being a member to be a missionary. It's an and. We need to be a member and be a missionary. So what you've got on the addition end is the Acts 2 church living in common. It's the idea that insiders were behaving in a way that outsiders wanted to be a part of it. That's where our role as a family member fits in. And we need to do whatever we've got to do as family members there. But at the same time, there's the dimension of living sent. The gospel spreads by people who go. And so we not only need to be family members, we've got to balance that with being everyday missionaries. And as I said earlier, in the local church, we focus a lot on the family member piece. We want people to show up for an hour to church, be in small group for an hour, serve for an hour. And unfortunately, what happens with this mobilization scale is that we're contending for a handful of hours a week with people. We're not building that living in common family. And as a result, we have to prioritize our time to volunteerism without the margin to really mobilize people as everyday missionaries. If we're taking the most basic, simple missionary pathway, then at the micro level, the experience of an individual Christ follower who's been sent and mobilized, they first have to become an everyday missionary. They have to embrace that role. They have to embrace the idea that they have a unique Ephesians 2:10 calling, and they have to see their mission field locally as an opportunity. I'm just going to say that partly because of how we've hijacked this with the volunteerism, this is an element, this first one, of helping come alongside everyday Jesus followers and helping them see that they've got a unique calling, that they have a role as a missionary, and there's a unique mission field for them. We rarely get past this first bullet. This missionary pathway is pretty much non-existent in a lot of churches. So this pathway we've tried to keep simple here. Step one is embracing, you could say, your calling or identity as a missionary. I've then got to live as a missionary. If I'm going to be a missionary with a mission field, I got to sow gospel seeds within that mission field. I've got to form some kind of gospel community around those seeds that are being formed. And then finally, I need to extend the gospel impact that's happening. Really, if we think of the local church as the home base, and each of these missionaries who are doing things, forming gospel community in the form of small groups or Discovery Bible studies or whatever they might be, those are outposts then of the local church. So we're extending the gospel impact by seeing these everyday missionaries carrying the gospel beyond the walls of the church. If we move on to the third micro pathway, we've called it the leader pathway. This is the one where the other two pathways, the disciple-making pathway and the missionary pathway, ought to apply to 100% of people who are Christ followers. The leader pathway is more like it's kind of like the dimmer switch on a light. 100% of Christians down at the here end of the spectrum ought to be servant stewards. If we're a member of the local church, if we're a Jesus follower, we are both a servant and a steward of what's happening in the local church. So I would say 100% of people are the servant steward. Not all Christ followers are going to go on to be church planters. So somewhere along this spectrum of moving from servant steward to church planters, people are going to find where they fit along that leader pathway. But we have named it the leader pathway since the context here is church planting. If we press into this one a little more, this idea of servant, steward, and church planter, it's again, I'm going to keep pressing. It's an and, it's not an or. We're not moving people from one to the other. It's building on one to embrace the other. So Jesus' plan was both here and there. We spend, unfortunately, most of our time in the local church on the here. The national studies show that 93% of churches essentially don't have a there context. Jesus intends for us to be growing churches here and planting churches there. I'm calling that capacity building. How do we build this capacity in the local church that helps pour gas on the disciple making and mobilization efforts that we have to do things? So local capacity is the local church. That's the here piece. That's where we are called to be servant stewards there. In the new capacity end that we sell multiplication, that's where catalytic leaders like church planters are going off and forming new things. And so the most basic pathway for the leader pathway would be serving others. I need to do whatever I need to do to, whether it's holding babies or greeting people at doors or making coffee, the idea of serving other people. We move to leading other people, apprenticing other people, releasing and sending others, and then ultimately reproducing gospel community is where the leader pathway goes to. I didn't mention it, but on the disciple-making path, that's about how we add. On the mobilization pathway, that's about how we extend. And on the leader pathway, it's how we scale. So we go from simply adding to extending to scaling our impact, which is what's needed for the gospel saturation that we've talked about. If we take all three of these pathways, I'm just putting all the basic pathways onto one page, 3 integrated micro pathways: the disciple maker pathway, the everyday missionary, the leader. These, again, are not legalistic lists. They aren't directly out of the Bible. These are simply the starting points we're giving in this multipliers pathway for people to be thinking. Now, the key is how these integrate together. It's not like an everyday Jesus follower can compartmentalize their life and think, oh, right now I'm a disciple maker, and this afternoon I'm going to focus on being a missionary, and tomorrow I'll be a leader. The issue is, how do you integrate together simultaneously these 3 roles? And if we just start at the micro level, we could probably connect the dots on these lines. Like, when I become a disciple and disciple maker, that's the best time for me to see myself as an everyday missionary and step into that role and to immediately start serving others. So the first 3 bullets on here really are kind of an identity piece. I'm embracing my identity as a disciple. I'm embracing my identity as an everyday missionary, and I'm embracing my identity as a servant. And we could then start, okay, what happens after I do that? Okay, I begin growing as a disciple. I begin living as a missionary. And so we could create an integrated single micro pathway that would be how all these dots connect together. And we want to be careful not to quickly overwhelm people. So this idea that let's do whatever we do at the level that a 9th grader can follow it is where we need to be able to boil these things down into a more simple form. So we've got the 3 micro pathways. That's where this idea of boiling things down into a simpler form is where the mobilization flywheel fits. The question is, how do we integrate the 3 micro pathways into a single flywheel that flywheel not only works for the individual disciple, but helps us form new churches out of just the normative way that we're integrating the micro pathway. The integrated pathway is for equipping and mobilizing disciple-making missionaries. The way we've presented just a simple starting point, but again, this is not a legalistic picture. This is just how we've taken the micro pathways and tried to boil them down. This is all from the individual disciple's perspective. It starts with the green E, that an individual needs to enter their unique mission field, which inherent in that is that they've become an everyday disciple. They have embraced their role as a missionary. They're starting to pursue understanding what their unique calling is, what their unique mission field is. There's a whole number of things that happen at that green E level. And again, we're at the micro level right now. There's a coinciding macro picture. That's what we do in the local church to facilitate these micro things happening. So if we were wanting to really, at that green E level, have people embracing their identity as a disciple, embrace their identity as a servant, and embrace their identity as a missionary, what would the things be that we would put in place at the church to really pour gas on those efforts happening at the micro level? That person who enters the mission field then begins sowing gospel seeds that may take the form of relationship building, prayer walking. It's where evangelism begins to happen with others. There's a whole host of activities that happen within that sowing gospel seeds. We have to keep our sights set on the red end, just the making disciple makers. If we mobilize an army of people to do the E and S, the green and the orange S, without our sights set on making disciple makers, we're just doing a form of social good. If we're simply seeing everybody is a missionary with a mission field to go out and sow seeds. We risk that we might just be having a social gospel there without actually making disciples. So we've got to keep the eye on the ball that it's about making disciples. As we're making disciples and in the process of seeking to make disciples, the Blue F is starting to gather people around faith. I would call it faith-driven gatherings, whether those are in the form of small groups, discovery Bible studies, or other cause-based things. But it's the idea of we're forming communities of faith around what we're doing. Some of those forming faith communities will spin off or have the potential to spin off as the launch team for new churches. Now, inherent in that is that we have to open our eyes to maybe a broader way than just the normative way of planting, which is launching large, high-cost church plants in white suburban areas. A lot of those blue ends right there may be bivocational church plants. They may be house churches. They may be full-size launch large churches, but we've got to have an open eyes to seeing new ways of doing those things. With that mobilization flywheel in place, that's what we've covered so far in this multipliers pathway. We're about to turn our attention to the lower right quadrant of the gospel saturation vision scope, which is what we would say is intentionality. This is where we really start taking the macro elements, especially the macro capacity building, which is the here and there, and we start doing strategic planning. Some of this planning is going to have a local here context. If you're feeling like there's things you really strongly want to work on that fit into these micro pathways, they fit in here. But there's also going to be the external or their factors of planting more churches and engaging church planting. So we're really going to shift our focus from what we've called the could-be context, where each of you have been pretending to be a church plant, and now we're going to move you into the reality of the churches you're in and what will be in place as a part of this intentionality of planning. And finally, we'll start transitioning then toward the end of our time together on the actual impact or the scorecard that's put in place for multiplication in your church. Out of this should be a set of custom products for your church. This strategic plan in the lower right corner is intended to produce a context-specific plan for church planting in your specific church. So I want to thank you for joining me. I know we're repeating a number of things, but this gospel saturation vision scope is very important. And some of you it's brand new for you, so we're feeling like repetition is good. I'm wanting you out of this video to really understand how the micro pathways and the macro culture piece fit together to point toward the gospel saturation vision that we are working toward. I want to remind you, if you can scan that QR code, that's where all of the multipliers pathway resources are, including this slide deck and a number of other slide decks. We're trying to create slide decks for every video that we do at this point. We have videos for all the core frameworks, visual guides, ebooks, workbooks. It's just take advantage of all these resources.